They call it the greatest film never to win Best Picture, a movie that bombed at the box office but found immortality through word of mouth. For 3 decades, The Shawshank Redemption has been celebrated as the ultimate story of hope and friendship. But what if everything you thought you knew about this beloved masterpiece was carefully constructed lies? Today, we're exposing the dark secrets that the cast and crew have kept hidden for 30 years. Revelations so disturbing that they'll completely change how you see Andy Dufresne's journey forever. The truth about what really happened behind those prison walls isn't the inspiring story Hollywood wants you to believe. It's a tale of psychological manipulation, on-set breakdowns, and controversial decisions that nearly destroyed careers. From Morgan Freeman's shocking confessions about his character's true nature to Tim Robbins' dangerous acting methods that pushed him to the edge of sanity, these aren't feel-good behind-the-scenes stories. These are the dark revelations that reveal how this so-called redemption story was built on a foundation of secrets, lies, and disturbing truths that have been buried for decades. Before we dive into the cast's most disturbing revelations, you need to understand how this entire nightmare began. When Frank Darabont approached Stephen King about adapting his novella, King made what seemed like a generous gesture, selling the rights for just $1. But what the public never knew was the twisted reason behind this seemingly charitable act. King later revealed in private interviews that he sold the rights so cheaply because he genuinely believed the story was impossible to film. He thought it would fail spectacularly and serve as a lesson to young filmmakers about the dangers of adapting his work. King expected Darabont to crash and burn, using his story as the vehicle for that destruction. This wasn't generosity, it was a calculated setup designed to humiliate an ambitious director. The dollar sale created something far more sinister than creative freedom. It gave Darabont unprecedented control over material that King never intended to succeed, setting the stage for the psychological experiments that would later traumatize the cast. Studio executives, feeling they had nothing to lose on such a cheap acquisition, allowed Darabont to push boundaries that should never have been crossed. Tim Robbins revealed years later that this unusual beginning created a toxic atmosphere from day one. The cast knew they were working on what King considered a throwaway project, and that knowledge ate away at their confidence throughout filming. They weren't making a potential classic, they were performing in what the original author expected to be an expensive failure. The decision to film at the Ohio State Reformatory wasn't just about authenticity, it was about psychological manipulation on a scale that would be considered unethical by today's standards. This massive, imposing structure had been closed in 1990 due to inhumane conditions so severe that human rights organizations had demanded its shutdown. When the cast walked through those gates each morning, they weren't just entering a movie set. They were stepping into a place where decades of human suffering had soaked into the very walls. Clancy Brown, who played the brutal Captain Hadley, later admitted that something genuinely disturbing happened to everyone who worked there. The prison didn't just provide atmosphere, it actively changed the actors' personalities. Brown confessed that he found himself becoming genuinely aggressive during filming, carrying the character's brutality home with him each night. The line between performance and reality became dangerously blurred. Tim Robbins took this psychological immersion to dangerous extremes. He would spend hours alone in the cells between takes, deliberately subjecting himself to the claustrophobic reality of incarceration. Robbins described experiencing genuine panic attacks when the cell doors closed, but he refused to stop these sessions. He believed that only by actually suffering could he understand Andy's mental state. What makes this even more disturbing is that many of the extras in the film were actually former inmates of that very prison. Frank Darabont deliberately hired men who had served time there, claiming he wanted authentic reactions. But what he really created was a twisted reunion between traumatized former prisoners and the place that had broken them. These men weren't acting during the yard scenes and meal sequences. They were reliving their own experiences of psychological torture. The production team's attention to detail extended to aging the walls differently for scenes set in different decades. They gradually made them cleaner as the film moved backward in time. But this process involved researching the actual conditions prisoners had endured during specific years. The crew members tasked with this research reported nightmares about the horrific living conditions they discovered in historical records. Morgan Freeman later revealed that this environment fundamentally changed his approach to Red. He wasn't playing a character in a movie anymore. He was channeling the spirit of a man who had been genuinely destroyed by this specific place. Freeman admitted that distinguishing between his own thoughts and Red's became increasingly difficult as filming progressed. What Morgan Freeman revealed about developing Red's character goes far beyond typical method acting. Freeman created an extensive criminal backstory that was so detailed and disturbing that it began to affect his mental health during filming. In Freeman's version, Red wasn't just someone who had committed murder. He was a man who had systematically destroyed an entire community through his criminal enterprise. Freeman envisioned Red as someone who ran numbers in the black community during the late 1930s and early 1940s, but his operation went far beyond simple gambling. In Freeman's backstory, Red had manipulated families into debt, broken up marriages, and driven several people to suicide through his ruthless collection methods. The murder that sent him to Shawshank wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated execution designed to send a message to his other victims. This backstory explained Red's unique position in Shawshank and his ability to get things, but it also meant that Freeman was essentially playing a sociopath who had learned to hide his true nature behind a facade of wisdom and kindness. Freeman described having to access genuine cruelty within himself to understand how Red could maintain such a convincing act of rehabilitation. The psychological toll became evident during Freeman's famous narration recording sessions. The first sessions, recorded in Iowa, had to be scrapped not because of technical issues, but because Freeman's voice carried an undertone of genuine menace that was too unsettling for the film's tone. The 3 weeks of re-recording weren't just about removing audio hiss. They were about Freeman learning to suppress the darker aspects of his character interpretation. Freeman also revealed that he based aspects of Red's institutionalization on his own father's struggles with depression in later years. This personal connection to mental illness, combined with the disturbing criminal backstory he had created, led to what Freeman described as a period of genuine psychological distress during and after filming. Perhaps most disturbing was Freeman's admission that the scene where Red feeds birds wasn't in the original script. Freeman suggested it because he had observed how his own father's depression manifested in similar behaviors. The loneliness in that simple act wasn't acting. It was Freeman channeling his own family's experience with mental illness and projecting it onto a character he had deliberately designed to be fundamentally broken. Tim Robbins' approach to playing Andy Dufresne went far beyond typical character preparation and entered territory that modern film productions would consider psychologically dangerous. Robbins didn't just create a character, he systematically fractured his own personality to embody what he saw as Andy's fundamental split between public facade and private reality. Robbins revealed that he actually developed what he called 2 separate operating systems for Andy. There was the public Andy that other prisoners saw, characterized by careful, methodical behavior and emotional restraint. But there was also the private Andy, the one digging through the wall at night, and this version was driven by what Robbins described as controlled insanity. The most disturbing aspect was that Robbins began to experience this split in his own life, finding himself switching between these 2 personalities even when not filming. The physical aspects of this transformation were extreme. For scenes showing Andy's public persona, Robbins kept his body rigid and his gestures minimal, but for private moments, he would deliberately alter his breathing patterns, his posture, and even his metabolism to create what he called the real Andy. This wasn't just acting technique, it was deliberate psychological conditioning that affected Robbins' mental state for months. Robbins also revealed that he used isolation techniques between takes that bordered on self-harm. He would lock himself in reproduction cells that the production had built and deliberately trigger claustrophobic responses. Robbins believed that only by genuinely experiencing the psychological pressure of imprisonment could he understand Andy's mental journey. The most controversial aspect of Robbins' preparation involved his work with a criminal psychologist who had studied long-term prisoners. This expert taught Robbins techniques for mental compartmentalization that were typically used to help violent offenders suppress their dangerous impulses. Robbins essentially learned to think like someone with dissociative personality disorder, a condition that can have permanent psychological effects. Frank Darabont later admitted that he became concerned about Robbins' mental health during filming. Robbins would sometimes remain in character for hours after scenes ended, unable to immediately return to his normal personality. The director described watching Robbins struggle to remember which version of himself he was supposed to be during casual conversations with cast and crew. Perhaps most disturbing was Robbins' revelation that some of his most praised scenes in the film weren't actually scripted performances. During the famous opera scene, where Andy plays music over the prison speakers, Robbins was genuinely dissociating from reality. The transcendent expression on his face wasn't acting. It was Robbins experiencing a genuine psychological break that happened to be captured on film. The scenes that were cut from the Shawshank Redemption weren't removed for pacing or length concerns. They were removed because they revealed truths about the characters and story that would have fundamentally changed how audiences perceived the film. These deletions weren't creative decisions. They were damage control measures designed to hide the darker realities that the cast had uncovered during filming. The most controversial deleted scene involved Red's life after release from prison. What audiences saw in the final film was a brief montage of Red adjusting to life outside. What they didn't see was an extended sequence showing Red experiencing what could only be described as complete psychological collapse. The deleted footage showed Red having a full panic attack in a grocery store, becoming so disoriented that he was nearly hospitalized. In this longer sequence, Red doesn't just feel uncomfortable in the outside world. He becomes genuinely dangerous. The deleted scene showed him stealing items from stores, not because he needed them, but because the act of theft was the only behavior that felt normal to him. Even more disturbing was a sequence where Red follows a woman home from the grocery store, not with any malicious intent, but because he had become incapable of making independent decisions about where to go or what to do. The scene culminated with Red in a bathroom stall, which was the only place he felt safe, because it reminded him of his prison cell. But the deleted footage showed him carving "Red was here" into the bathroom wall with genuine desperation, as if he was trying to prove to himself that he still existed. The scene was so unsettling that test audiences became genuinely concerned about Red's mental state, asking theater staff if the character was going to hurt himself or others. Frank Darabont's original ending was even more disturbing. Instead of the uplifting beach reunion, Darabont wanted to end the film with Red on the bus to Mexico, but with clear implications that he was having a psychotic break. The final shot would have been Red's face in the bus window, smiling, but with the kind of vacant expression that suggested he wasn't really present anymore. The implication was that Red wasn't actually going to find Andy. He was escaping into a delusion that would ultimately lead to his death. Another deleted scene dealt with the discovery of Andy's escape tunnel, but it revealed details that made the escape seem less like triumph and more like the actions of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. The extended sequence showed guards finding evidence that Andy had been living in the tunnel for weeks before his actual escape, surviving on rats and rainwater. The scene suggested that Andy hadn't just planned an escape, he had experienced a complete psychological break that led him to abandon any connection to human society. Perhaps most disturbing was the deleted scene showing Brooks feeding his crow. The original footage was much longer and showed Brooks having conversations with the bird that revealed the depth of his mental illness. Brooks wasn't just lonely, he was experiencing auditory hallucinations and believed the bird was talking back to him. The scene was cut because it made Brooks's eventual suicide seem not like a tragedy, but like the inevitable result of severe untreated mental illness. The conflicts during filming weren't typical creative disagreements. They were genuine psychological confrontations between people who had been fundamentally changed by the disturbing material they were working with. Morgan Freeman and Frank Darabont's relationship became so toxic that Freeman later described their interactions as psychological warfare. The root of their conflict wasn't artistic vision. It was Freeman's growing concern that Darabont was deliberately traumatizing the cast for the sake of authenticity. Freeman revealed that Darabont would sometimes extend scenes far beyond what was necessary, forcing actors to remain in disturbing emotional states for hours at a time. Freeman described feeling like he was being used as a subject in some kind of psychological experiment. The famous scene where Red and Andy talk in the prison yard took 9 hours to film, not because of technical difficulties, but because Darabont insisted on dozens of takes that served no apparent purpose. Freeman threw a baseball for the entire 9 hours, but what the public wasn't told was that Darabont was deliberately trying to exhaust Freeman to the point where his emotional defenses would break down. The director wanted to capture what he called genuine institutional fatigue on Freeman's face. Tim Robbins nearly quit the production twice, not because of creative differences, but because he was experiencing what he later described as systematic psychological abuse. Robbins revealed that Darabont would deliberately trigger his claustrophobic episodes and then continue filming to capture his genuine distress. What audiences saw as brilliant acting was often Robbins having actual panic attacks that were being recorded without his consent. The poster controversy involved more than just the logical impossibility of Andy reattaching it from inside the tunnel. The real issue was that the poster had to be reset multiple times during filming, and each reset required someone to actually crawl through the tunnel that had been built for the production. Several crew members suffered genuine psychological trauma from being in that confined space. But Darabont insisted on multiple retakes that served no purpose other than to maintain the authenticity of the actors' disturbed reactions. Bob Gunton, who played Warden Norton, revealed that his character's suicide scene was filmed multiple times with increasing levels of violence. Darabont wasn't satisfied with a simple gunshot. He wanted to capture what he called the authentic desperation of institutional collapse. The deleted footage included extended sequences of Norton's psychological breakdown that were so disturbing they couldn't be included in any version of the film. Perhaps most troubling was the revelation that Darabont had researched actual prisoner abuse techniques and incorporated them into his direction methods. Cast members were subjected to what amounted to psychological torture, all in the name of creating authentic performances. Several actors required therapy after filming, concluded, though this was kept quiet to protect the film's reputation. The crew members who worked on aging the prison walls were required to research historical prisoner abuse in detail, leading to what several of them described as vicarious trauma. The production created an environment where everyone involved was systematically exposed to the psychological damage of imprisonment, and the line between research and abuse became completely blurred. The symbolic elements throughout the Shawshank Redemption weren't subtle metaphors for hope and redemption. They were coded warnings about the psychological destruction that the characters were actually experiencing. Once you understand the real meaning behind these symbols, the entire film becomes a story about mental breakdown disguised as inspiration. The weather patterns throughout the film weren't just atmospheric mood setting. They were a systematic representation of the characters' deteriorating mental states. Every scene with rain corresponds to moments when characters are losing their grip on reality. The thunderstorm during Andy's escape wasn't nature matching the drama of his breakout. It was the external manifestation of his complete psychological collapse. The poster progression from Rita Hayworth to Marilyn Monroe to Raquel Welch wasn't about Andy's journey toward freedom. It was a visual representation of his descent into what psychologists call objectification psychosis. Each poster represented a further disconnect from human relationships and a deeper retreat into fantasy. By the time Andy reaches the Raquel Welch poster, he's no longer capable of forming genuine human connections. The religious imagery throughout the film, particularly the constant Bible references, weren't about redemption. They were about the way institutional abuse uses religious concepts to justify psychological torture. Warden Norton's Bible quotes weren't hypocrisy. They were the authentic voice of institutional religion that has always been used to break prisoners' spirits and convince them they deserve their suffering. The famous "get busy living" or "get busy dying" line isn't an inspirational message about choosing hope. It's a description of the two final options available to people whose minds have been completely shattered by institutional abuse. Red isn't choosing life over death. He's choosing delusion over suicide. The living he chooses isn't genuine existence. It's the fantasy that allows him to avoid confronting the reality of his psychological destruction. The music throughout the film serves as an audio representation of dissociative episodes. The Thomas Newman score wasn't designed to evoke emotion. It was structured to mirror the brain patterns of people experiencing severe psychological trauma. The music becomes more hopeful as the film progresses because it's following the characters' retreat into increasingly elaborate delusions. Even the famous opera scene has a dark symbolic meaning that most viewers miss completely. The piece from Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro is about revealing a husband's infidelity, which directly mirrors Andy's situation. But the way Andy plays it over the prison speakers isn't an act of rebellion. It's a psychotic break where he forces everyone to share in his delusion that his wife was unfaithful. He's not spreading hope. He's spreading his own psychological damage to the entire prison population. The movie posters that hide Andy's tunnel aren't symbols of escape. They're representations of the fantasy worlds that prisoners retreat to when reality becomes unbearable. Andy doesn't dig through the wall to gain physical freedom. He digs through the barriers between reality and delusion. The tunnel isn't a pathway to Mexico, it's a metaphor for the psychological escape into madness. The transformation of the Ohio State Reformatory into a tourist attraction represents something far more disturbing than simple movie memorabilia commercialization. What's happened to this former prison reveals the disturbing way that society has romanticized psychological abuse and turned genuine human suffering into entertainment. The prison now draws over 100,000 visitors annually. But what these tourists are actually celebrating isn't the triumph of the human spirit. They're engaging in what psychologists call trauma tourism, where people seek entertainment from places where systematic abuse occurred. The fact that this particular location was closed due to inhumane conditions makes the tourism industry that has grown around it particularly grotesque. Tim Robbins has expressed genuine horror at what the prison has become. He revealed that visitors often ask to be locked in the cells where filming took place, not understanding that they're requesting to experience the same psychological torture that broke thousands of real prisoners over the decades. The prison tour guides have been trained to present this as harmless fun, but they're actually facilitating a form of psychological voyeurism. The Shawshank Trail, that includes over a dozen filming locations throughout the region, represents the commercialization of a production that genuinely traumatized everyone involved. Visitors follow a route that traces the psychological breakdown of both fictional characters and the real actors who portrayed them, all while being told it's an inspiring story about hope and friendship. Local economic development has become dependent on what amounts to the commercialization of psychological abuse. The region's tourism industry actively promotes the prison experience as family-friendly entertainment, encouraging visitors to take photos in cells where real prisoners experience decades of torture. The disconnect between the historical reality and the marketing message represents a form of collective psychological denial. Former cast and crew members have reported feeling genuinely disturbed when they learn about visitor behavior at the prison. People don't come to remember the victims of institutional abuse or to honor those who suffered there. They come to reenact scenes from a movie that they believe is about hope, never understanding that they're celebrating a place where systematic psychological destruction occurred for generations. The prison's gift shop sells merchandise that turns symbols of suffering into commercial products. Visitors can buy replica movie posters, toy rock hammers, and even prison uniforms, all while being completely unaware that they're purchasing souvenirs that represent the tools and symbols of psychological torture. The commercialization has become so complete that the actual history of human rights violations has been entirely erased from the tourist experience. Most disturbing is the way that the movie's reputation has been used to sanitize the prison's actual history. Instead of confronting the reality of what happened there, the tourism industry has replaced historical truth with Hollywood fantasy. Visitors leave thinking they've experienced something uplifting when they've actually participated in the erasure of systematic abuse that affected thousands of real people. As The Shawshank Redemption approaches its 30th anniversary, the question isn't why this film has maintained such a powerful hold on audiences. The question is how a story built on psychological manipulation and systematic abuse has been repackaged as the ultimate tale of hope and friendship. The answer reveals something deeply disturbing about how society processes stories of institutional trauma. The film's enduring popularity isn't based on its inspirational message. It's based on its success in convincing audiences that psychological destruction can be reframed as spiritual redemption. The movie teaches viewers that systematic abuse is acceptable as long as it produces a satisfying narrative conclusion. This isn't hope, it's the normalization of trauma through entertainment. Morgan Freeman's famous closing lines about hope being a good thing, maybe the best of things, weren't originally intended as inspiration. Freeman has revealed that he delivered those lines while thinking about his father's struggle with depression and the way that false hope can actually prevent people from seeking real help for psychological damage. The line's popularity represents society's preference for comforting delusions over difficult truths. The movie's technical excellence, from Roger Deakins' cinematography to Thomas Newman's score, serves to disguise the fundamentally disturbing nature of the story being told. The beautiful visuals and emotional music create a hypnotic effect that prevents audiences from recognizing that they're watching a story about mental breakdown, not redemption. Frank Darabont's direction wasn't brilliant filmmaking, it was successful propaganda that convinced millions of people to celebrate psychological abuse as long as it was presented with proper emotional manipulation. The film's critical acclaim represents the complete success of this deception, proving that audiences will embrace any message if it's packaged with sufficient technical skill. The cast members who have spoken honestly about their experiences have revealed a production process that would be considered psychological abuse by any reasonable standard. Yet their suffering has been transformed into promotional material that celebrates the film's authenticity and emotional depth. The actors' genuine trauma has become part of the movie's marketing appeal. Tim Robbins' later work with prison reform organizations isn't inspired by positive messages from the film. It's motivated by his understanding of how institutional abuse actually operates, and his guilt over participating in a movie that romanticizes psychological destruction. His activism represents an attempt to counteract the damage done by the film's false message about prison experiences. The Shawshank Redemption doesn't represent hope triumphing over despair. It represents the complete success of institutional propaganda that convinces victims to celebrate their own destruction. The movie's popularity proves that audiences will enthusiastically embrace stories that normalize systematic abuse, as long as those stories are presented as inspirational tales of personal growth. The film's true legacy isn't its message about the power of hope. It's its demonstration of how effectively psychological manipulation can be disguised as entertainment. For 30 years, millions of viewers have celebrated a story about mental breakdown, believing they were witnessing a tale of spiritual redemption. This represents one of the most successful deceptions in cinema history. The cast revelations we've explored today aren't just behind-the-scenes trivia. They're evidence of how the entertainment industry systematically exploits real psychological trauma to create profitable products. The Shawshank Redemption stands as proof that audiences will pay to witness suffering, as long as that suffering is properly reframed as inspiration. The next time you watch The Shawshank Redemption, remember that the hope you're seeing isn't real. It's a carefully constructed illusion designed to make psychological destruction palatable to mass audiences. The redemption in the title isn't about the characters finding peace. It's about the film industry successfully transforming genuine human suffering into commercial entertainment. These aren't the secrets of a beloved classic. They're the confessions of a successful con game that has been fooling audiences for 3 decades. The Shawshank Redemption isn't the greatest film never to win Best Picture. It's the most successful piece of institutional propaganda ever created, and its continued popularity proves that the con is still working perfectly. Remember to like this video if these revelations shocked you, and subscribe for more deep dives into the dark secrets behind your favorite films. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the truths that Hollywood doesn't want you to know. What do you think was the most disturbing revelation about The Shawshank Redemption? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who thinks they know the real story behind this so-called masterpiece.